good morning or afternoon, depending on what time it is where you're watching. Thank you for joining today. I am super excited about today's guest, Rebecca Busaca. I've been trying to keep up with short-term Pell, but I have to admit I was on the struggle bus until I met Rebecca. But Rebecca, you shared your expertise and caught me up to speed quickly. And you are currently serving as the president of the National Accreditation Commission. I think you've also been invited to provide some feedback on federal legislation here and there. Before we get started, is there anything else you'd like to share with our audience?
Well, I want to say thank you so much for having me here today. It's indeed a pleasure. And Karen, I mean, you bring so much to the table. I'm just excited to have this conversation and hopefully to educate your audience and, to continue to build accreditation in a new and innovative way. Give you a little bit of background. Believe it or not, I have spent 30 years in accreditation. I started working for an accrediting agency in 1994. I have had boots on the ground at least 500 schools around the globe before COVID. And the bulk of my time in accreditation has been connected to the workforce training programs. We even evaluated employers' training programs. And so I think what really excites me most today is that we're sort of living through one of the most important transformations in education in decades. Mm-hmm. And this directly correlates to workforce Pell. So I think we're starting to see this confluence of workforce education, higher education, employers, and government moving toward a shared goal, which is helping learners acquire skills that lead to careers, believe it or not.
Right.
So what we're doing at the National Accreditation Commission is building a quality assurance system that's specifically for workforce training programs. There's no one else like us in the country. We are focused on the non-credit, non-degree side of the house. And we're not here to create more bureaucracy. We're here to create more confidence for the students in the training programs that they take and to help their higher education or post-secondary education institutions innovate quickly to ensure that students graduate with credentials that actually lead to employment, wage growth, and long-term career mobility. So that's what I'm doing. Excited to share with you.
And I'm just curious, what inspires someone to get into the accreditation space? Some might think it's a little dry.
Well, that is a good question. Before I got into the accreditation space, I worked for a school that was not accredited. And that institution was very interested in international students. So that's really kind of how I got into it. Was a forced situation. In order for them to have the authority to enroll F1 and M1 students, they had to be accredited. So I said, hey, how do you go about this process? And I don't know, I fell in love with it. I'm one of those people, I like to get in the weeds. I'm interested in compliance and outcomes. And so I started in 94 and I'm still in it. So
still going.
I think it's exciting.
You started when you were 12. Okay. So you kind of hinted at this earlier, but the Department of Education is starting, I think, to focus a lot more on outcomes, blurring the lines between national and regional accreditation. And some people say there's no difference now. I don't know that the language has changed around that. But given how the landscape is shifting and where you sit and the conversations that you've been in, what's the single biggest misunderstandings institutions have right now about what accreditors are actually looking for?
I mean, if you ask me, I think the biggest misunderstanding is they think accreditors want more documentation. That's not the case. They have lots of documentation. I think what accreditors are looking for that schools are challenged in some ways to collect is evidence that they're meeting their mission, that their training programs are directly aligned with employer needs and expectations. And, this conversation has shifted pretty dramatically over the years. I think, historically, when you looked at IPED's data, it was all about, did students complete? What are their persistence rates? But today, accreditors are asking, did students actually benefit from the program? Did they get a job that was training related? And I think that means outcomes matter today more than ever. So it's not just about completion, persistence, but it's about employment, wages, employer satisfaction, and whether graduates and even non-completers from these programs continue advancing in their careers. So, everybody says accreditors looking to see if your library's big and they're checking boxes. That's just a myth. I mean, this is not a box checking exercise by any stretch of the imagination. It's really about the institution proving value and instilling trust in the student, in their state regulators, in their federal regulators, and ultimately in themselves.
Do you think is the federal government asking different things of accreditors now?
Well, the federal government is always asking different questions because
because it's always changing.
Oh, it's always changing. So this is an iterative process, and the federal government is codifying lending programs and grant programs. And when they create those programs, sometimes I think they lose sight of what are the implications of these funding programs. It's not always about getting students in faster, ensuring that they have more money to pay for the training. And I'll give you an example, because I have been in the workforce space for a long time. I have seen these very short programs, like a CNA program that was it was approved through the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. And this is across the nation. I'm not just talking about one program. And, these programs started out like 300 clock hours. And then they modified some of the Pell provisions so that you could access Pell at 600 clock hours. It was previously 900 clock hours. So then you saw a 300 clock hour CNA program become a 600 clock hour CNA program, and then it became a 900 clock hour program. And then the nation moved our funding model to support degree attainment. And when that happened, then that became an associate's degree. So you can start to see how over many years, over the last 30 years of my career, when the government takes action and modifies our lending scenarios or our grant scenarios, it has this huge implication for the way in which institutions codify curriculum, select and enroll students, and the ripple effect from it is not always good.
So let's talk a little bit more about that, because short-term Pell is all the buzz. How are accreditors thinking about short-term Pell? And I know this is right up your alley. I mean, are the frameworks changing? And as we put more, I guess, focus on workforce Pell, is there any risk to stifling the quick responses that employers need in some of these training programs?
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm really excited about workforce Pell. In fact, I had the inkling that it was coming down the pike, and everybody's been talking about it. It wasn't just like it was in the universe for me, but I just sensed that this was going to happen, and mainly because students were looking for shorter term, more immersive style training. And so if you ask me, I think Workforce Pell represents one of the most exciting policy changes that we've seen in workforce education in my entire career. And the challenge here isn't the legislation, because everyone thinks short workforce Pell is the legislation too hard, it's too many things we have to do. But I disagree. I think the challenge is making sure that your programs that are receiving taxpayer dollars, federal aid, are truly high quality. And on the accreditation side of the house, bear in mind we have institutional accreditors, we have programmatic accreditors. Institutional accreditors are your Title IV gatekeepers. And the last thing they want to do is slow innovation. But what they do want, and what we are attempting to do at the National Accreditation Commission, is to create guardrails that protect students while allowing the institutions to respond rapidly to employer demand. And I think the best workforce programs constantly evolve. You don't create it and then 5 years
Right.
later update it. You really have to stay on these programs. And as AI is coming into play, I mean, everything is moving so quick, like the speed of light right now.
Yeah.
So we have to be much more conscientious as accreditors about how do we keep up with this reindustrialization in this country. And so I
Right.
think this is a key area of focus for accreditors because institutional accreditors don't really evaluate programs. They are not programmatic accreditors. Not, I shouldn't say evaluate. They don't accredit programs. They accredit an institution as
Right.
a whole.
Okay. So, how do you define quality in the shorter term programs?
Well, in the past, I think we had just one metric. It was like placement.
Yeah.
And placement matters, wages matter, completion matters, but so does employer engagement. And I'm not just talking about the program action committees that every school has, they're required to have for accreditation. I'm talking about industry recognized credentials, credential portability. Students aren't staying at one school today. Most of them are kind of hopping around. And then they don't want to just hop around. They want to stack those credits from this program to that program to the next program so they can
Right.
save time, they can save money. And they want these programs to, I think, lead to like lifelong learning. So long-term career progression. When I was growing up, people had one job, they did that job. My parents still do that one job. But that's just not the way students and, our population thinks today. The younger generation, I don't know, they expect probably to have 8, 10 jobs and
Yeah.
8 to 10, maybe even careers. So a great workforce program doesn't just simply help someone get their first job. It really launches this trajectory toward a career. And that's a really very different conversation for accreditors and really for this country in the way in which we create curriculum and deliver
Yeah.
content.
And it's interesting that you just talked about the transition from, one thing to another. And with short-term Pell, we do have the opportunity. I think you have that lower is not the right word, but kind of that lower entry point into a career, where with a 4-year degree, there's kind of this higher expectation. And the latter might be a little shorter, right? When we're using short-term Pell and we're getting someone trained up to maybe do the very first job in a series of credentials, that opens up the question to me about prior learning assessment. I talked to a lot of people about prior learning assessment, and there's just kind of this persistent perception that accreditors don't like it, accreditors don't support it. Is that a myth or a misunderstanding of the standards? And kind of how do you see all that playing together then with these short-term PLA programs that, might not have direct credit equivalencies, but are still enough quality to apply to another program?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very complex situation. And, this country is very lucky to have somebody with your expertise asking the right questions, looking at these training programs. But I think that there's this kind of historical misunderstanding around PLA and how accreditors view it. I mean, I've been in space for 30 some odd years, looked at every accrediting agency, I think, on the planet. And all accreditors absolutely support prior learning assessment when it's rigorous and it's done properly. I mean, this is not about just like rubber stamping a program because they want to get a student in and enroll them today so they
Right.
can collect money from them. And there are some schools that do that. The key word for the accreditor how do you validate this? If you're
Right.
going to accept prior learning, how do you validate that it's legitimate? And I think accreditors aren't asking students to repeat learning. A lot of folks
Right.
think that they've already mastered. They're not expecting that. They're asking institutions to verify that prior learning was conducted through reliable assessment and that assessments can be evidenced. And now, coming out of negotiated rulemaking, and this more applies to transfer credit, but it'll have a trickle down effect into prior learning assessment. They want to start seeing this before the student actually enrolls in the program. Because in the end, PLA is good for every student because it reduces their costs, it shortens their
Yeah.
time to completion, and it really gets people into the workplace faster. So, and I'm not a PLA expert like you are, and maybe you want to take a moment here to educate the audience on what I'm overlooking here, but I think that PLA is going to become much more prevalent in this country, especially after the new regulations are published in November this year.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I think there's always been pockets of institutions that care deeply about prior learning assessment or had very strong connections, maybe with a military base that had a focused evaluation for certain military careers. I think widespread adoption of it has been challenged largely in philosophy, thinking that it's not a real thing, right? I think a lot of people hear prior learning, and if you're getting your workforce experience evaluated, that you're getting credit for work, which is not true, right? You're getting credit for what you learned from work and validating that work experience. I think we started to see an even, kind of bigger expansion into this space when micro credentials just kind of took over for a while. They're still very active, but I think there's been some settling in that market. But if you go get a certificate in Google Analytics and you learned everything, should that apply to, a degree? It depends on what you learned, right? And to your point, we have to have the systems and the structures in place to evaluate someone's background, whether it's structured or unstructured learning, and have a process to validate that they learned what they would have learned in the class, because it still does have to apply to the degree. So, yeah, I agree with you. And I think, for me, what I see sometimes when people are pushing back and they'll use accreditors as like, some of the specialized accreditors do have different opinions on, course sequencing and those types of things. But it really gets down to, well, I can't just give someone credit because they had a job. And at the core, that's not what prior learning assessment is. And so we spend a lot of time educating people on kind of those differences. But yeah, it's nice to hear that, the accreditation space is not anti prior learning assessment. And I actually think, with the work that you guys are doing, validating the quality of those short-term Pell programs will even kind of push us more to, these are accredited programs. How do you not stack them into a meaningful degree program if that's what the student wants, right? Not everybody has to get a degree, but if they choose to, the thing that they learned in the short-term Pell program that was essentially funded by taxpayer dollars should not go to waste at a university because of a perception problem.
I think we can move the needle is assessing skill and competency attainment when it occurs, because we're more often than not, when a student's in one of these training programs, albeit a non-credit continuing ed offering, there's not a satisfactory academic progress scenario there. So
Right.
If the student drops out, you're like, oh well, see you later, bye. That shouldn't be the case. We should be able to say, Rebecca learned this skill at this point. And, we're doing this at the National Accreditation Commission. So it's going to really, I think, be very helpful when you're looking at prior learning assessment, saying, she earned this, she evidenced in whatever training I'm taking. Maybe it's some work-based learning experience that I had this skill and this competency. And here's the date that I attained it. So if you can put that date on the resume, now the employer's not looking at my resume that's very dated. Oh, I got my degree back in, the old age, and they're
The
acknowledging that.
1900s.
Right, it was actually. So they're giving me credit for having a degree, but I forgot everything I learned. That's just so many years ago. So I think today, as we're really nailing down the floorboards around skill attainment, competency attainment, and how the employer can leverage that information to pick the right candidate or to determine where to reskill and upskill an individual. This is how the country needs to move. We're not going to look at your 4-year degree. We're going to look in your 4-year degree. When did you learn X, Y, and Z, and evidence you learned it? So I'm really excited about that, and building that into a prior learning assessment component. It's going to be fun. I think it's going to be great for the students. I think that there's all this clatter in this country around building these learner and employment records. I worked for a company that was building them, but they haven't really got the kind of traction that was anticipated. And so we're going to build our own self-sovereign wallet that ensures that student, no matter where they go, they take these credentials with them and they have that skill information embedded within it. And that wallet's going to feed right back into the accreditation decisions that the accreditors make around programs and around institutions, access to state and federal aid, and even employer funding too.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Yeah. Long answer to a short question.
It's great. So short-term Pell, I think, it sometimes gets championed as kind of this engine for equity, right? Getting non-traditional students into the workforce quickly so they can start their career. I think some people worry that it could trap low-income students into kind of rapid low-wage credentials and then push wealthier students into bachelor's degrees, master's degrees, and kind of bifurcate access to education. So how are you viewing your role as an accreditor to making sure that the short-term Pell programs actually provide the long-term upward economic mobility rather than just kind of that quick entry and then nothing follows?
Yeah, and this is going to be a question that you probably need to answer me or ask me again, and I'll answer maybe differently in a year. Because this is really the wild, wild west. So we're looking at a combination of continuing ed programs, adult education programs, non-credit programs, and even some credit-bearing programs that could lead to a credential. Now, that could be a certificate, it could be a degree. I mean, the goal for us is to understand these short-term training programs. Number one, are they aligned with employer needs in the region? Period. And so we're pulling data from the BLS, from the Census Bureau, from all these sources that are valid and reliable. And we are evaluating programs against that data to say, we're not really sure if you should teach this program in this region because students may not get a job when they come out. That's the goal of Workforce Pell. You got to have 70% completion, 70% job placement, and you have to show wage attainment. And then 5 years down the road, you'll have to show a value added earnings component. So did the student that took your Workforce Pell program actually get a job that led to them making better wages than what they would have gotten had they simply come out of high school and went directly into that job? So the only way for us to validate these training programs is to start with the employer first, always looking at employment data, and not only looking at employment data in the beginning of the accreditation process. We're going to look at these programs on a cohort by cohort basis, because in a region, an employer may only need 20 people to do a very specific job. I grew up on a farm in rural upstate New York, and there's only a handful of jobs. And so when those jobs are filled, should you continue offering a training program in that region? Maybe not. It's not saying you shouldn't stop teaching it entirely. maybe you shouldn't take public tax dollars for it. But down the road, you can reinitiate that program when there's a market for it. So I think this is going to be very different than what everybody's experienced in the past. Programs get accredited, they get listed on the institution's e-car, they access Title IV forever and ever and ever.
Right.
And ever. And now you can't do that because Workforce Pell is going to, the Department of Ed is going to look at this data on an annual basis. So if your program fails the 70% completion or 70% job placement metric and the wage metrics, the value-added earnings, the program will sit with no funding for a full 2 years. So we want to help the institutions avoid that. That should never happen to a school. If we help them collect this data, it's their own data, it's public data, assess these programs continuously. I think we cut this issue off at the pass. And then we're like pushing, it's like the stock market. You know, when you buy a stock, you want to pay attention to what's happening with that stock so that you don't stay in too long or you don't, get out too early. How do we iterate constantly and maybe slow enrollment during a period of decline in this profession and then increase enrollment at a time in which the region needs that?
I get that this is going to sound silly when I say it, but it sounds like a partnership. Yeah. And I don't know that holistically, like across all of the different accrediting bodies and all of the different types of schools, that a partnership is really kind of how people view accreditation, right? Even though it is, but what I'm hearing is you're partnering with the schools, you're partnering with the employers in an effort to protect the students and the taxpayers and the employers.
I mean, I couldn't have said it better. You're so beautiful and brilliant. That is true. That everybody's afraid of the accreditor because they think they're going to poke them with a sharp stick in their eye. And sometimes they need to poke you with a sharp stick in the eye. But the goal here is exactly what you said. It's a partnership. And one thing I haven't mentioned that I'm very proud of, it's the first time ever, we partnered with 3 institutional accreditors with Middle States Commission on Higher Education, the Northwest Commission for Higher Education, and WASC Senior, which is the California accreditor for the higher education institutions throughout the state. And so the National Accreditation Commission is sitting in the middle of these very prominent accreditors that are led by 3 brilliant women that are change agents. They are disruptors. Accreditors get a bad name in this country, but these women, they are champions of change. And I think that together, we're doing something so exciting and revolutionary. And you boiled it down to a simple statement. This is a partnership in quality, a partnership in change. And really, we are becoming a very student-centered group of women trying to help the institutions mitigate negativity, mitigate issues, help the governors in the states that are approving Workforce Pell programs not make bad decisions while iterating with the institutions. So state and federal aid and employer aid is allocated properly. So the student in the end is protected. Yeah. That's a key thing. We have got to protect these students. That is our job.
Yep. That's great. So I know we're running close on time, so I'm going to have 2 more questions for you. But let's say there's a president, a provost, a dean of workforce development, and they're watching this right now and they're preparing to submit for a bunch of new short-term Pell programs because it does sound attractive, right? There's a lot about it that sounds attractive. I think there's also a lot about it to me that is like, this is serious business. It's not as simple as putting some programs together and rolling them out. So what's the number one mistake that you see institutions make in these applications, and what should they do instead?
I would say the biggest mistake is designing programs from the classroom backwards instead of from the workforce backwards. Institutions today, this has been the case forever and a day. They begin with curriculum, with the textbook provider.
Yeah.
But really, the strongest programs need to begin with employers. Ask employers, not when they come for the donuts at your PAC committee. Ask employers in your region, study employment data. What competencies do you need? What equipment do graduates need to practice on? And what certifications really matter? Because certifications in one part of a state and another part of the state, I'm finding completely different. I mean, it's mind-boggling, right? There's so much.
And you see that with the trades, right? Depending on like with HVAC as an example, and I'm not an HVAC expert. In some places, everything's oil. In other places, everything's electric. So the curriculum has to be different based off of the location. And in some places, welders can be generalists, and in other places, they have to know TIG welding. And it's all regionally dependent on what the workforce there needs.
Right. And I think a big part of it too is like, what wages are employers paying? And we're studying these short-term workforce programs. And I want to put this out there because I think in this country, and you're a change agent and disruptor too, we need to pay CNAs, phlebotomists, EMTs, people doing really hard jobs. Those are really critical jobs in this country, the worst wages. And, I think it's kind of demoralizing. And if I have my druthers, I'm very hard-headed. I grew up on
it's Rebecca's world.
It has to stop. We have to leverage what we learn from Workforce Pell and from these short-term non-credit programs, how to elevate people and how to make sure they're getting paid for these jobs that we really can't live without in this country.
Sure.
Let's just be honest. They're critical professions in this nation, and we need more of these people to move into these professions and to feel good about what they're doing. I don't think we pay teachers enough either, but the teacher training programs are not coming through our Workforce Pell yet. Right. But a lot of these shorter term programs, we really start studying how to improve the wages.
Yeah. And I think sometimes the ahas in life are life dependent, right? You really don't think about what an LPN is getting paid until the first time you visit a family member in a care facility. Right. And you see the hard work that goes into that and the amount of care that you want your loved one provided. Kind of need to show that same care to the person taking care of them. And sometimes, to your point, those salaries are very low in those direct patient care positions where we need people to be caring and empathetic and have, the communication and the critical thinking skills, because those things they're handling things right in the moment. But it's not necessarily something that we reward them with financially.
Yeah, I mean, you put that shoe on your foot. You just said it so beautifully. I hope a lot of people hear this and hear your opinion on that, because you're spot on.
All right. So last words of advice for anyone listening in any of your areas of expertise, whether it's the wallet space, the accreditation space, how we make all of these things work together. What you got for us? Well,
I mean, I think we're entering this extraordinary moment in time, and technology is changing faster than education can, and they're struggling to keep up. Employers are changing faster, and student expectations are changing right here in the moment. And I think accreditation has to evolve. So we're doing that, and we're going to make accreditation maybe fun again. I don't know if it was ever fun, but maybe make it fun. And really, I think my simple advice is to folks out there that question accreditation and say stuff about it. Don't think about accreditation as something that you prepare for every 8 or 3 or 5 or 10
it's
years.
Every day.
Yeah, exactly. You took the words right out of my mouth. It's every day. No, it's perfect. And I love that our heads are synced. And if an institution continuously collects evidence, listens to employers, measures their outcomes, and improves their programs, accreditation is simply what it should be, a reflection of evidence, not an event to survive. And at the end of the day, This is about trust. Students are trusting institutions with their time. Their parents are trusting institutions with their children, and taxpayers are trusting us with institutions with their public dollars. And so, we've got to make sure that employers are also trusting these credentials. And our job is to make sure that that trust is well placed. And I hope that as a result of this podcast with you today, that we get more folks on board. The negativity around workforce Pell shouldn't be there. You shouldn't say, oh, we can't do this because 70% completion, 70% job placement, too hard to do. It's not too hard to do. You should hold yourself up higher and do better. And, I'm here to help with that. And I know you are too. So thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Appreciate your time.